Today's scripture is Genesis chapter 27 verses 1 through 13. Let's read it together. When Isaac was old and his eyes were so weak that he could no longer see, he called for Esau his older son and said to him, "My son." "Here I am," he answered. Isaac said, "I am now an old man and don't know the day of my death. Now then, get your equipment, your quiver and bow, and go out to the open country to hunt some wild game for me. Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like and bring it to me to eat so that I may give you my blessing before I die." Now Rebekah was listening as Isaac spoke to his son Esau. When Esau left for the open country to hunt game and bring it back, Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Look, I overheard your father say to your brother Esau, 'Bring me some game and prepare me some tasty food to eat, so that I may give you my blessing in the presence of the Lord before I die.' Now, my son, listen carefully and do what I tell you. Go out to the flock and bring me 2 choice young goats, so I can prepare some tasty food for your father, just the way he likes it. Then take it to your father to eat, so that he may give you his blessing before he dies." Jacob said to Rebekah his mother, "But my brother Esau is a hairy man while I have smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." His mother said to him, "My son, let the curse fall on me. Just do what I say. Go and get them for me." In the grand scope of the Bible, today's passage is a very important scene where the promise of blessing continues from Abraham to Isaac and then to Jacob. In Genesis 25, God had already declared to whom the promise of blessing, given to Abraham and passed to Isaac, would be passed on. Genesis 25:23 says this. Let me read it for you. "The Lord said to her, 'Two nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger.'" Genesis 27 is the beginning of the story that shows in detail how this promise made by God actually continues. Isaac is old, his eyesight has failed, and in his anxiety about his impending death, he intends to give his final blessing to his firstborn son, Esau. The blessing of the firstborn was considered an incredibly important ritual in the ancient world. It is said that in ancient Israel, a father's blessing was not seen as a simple wish but was believed to have the actual power to determine a child's future. Therefore, once a blessing was declared, it was considered irrevocable and unchangeable. It was not just words, they believed their destiny was on the line. Isaac asks Esau to hunt for him. Let's read verse 4 of chapter 27 together. "Prepare me the kind of tasty food I like, and bring it to me to eat, so that I may give you my blessing before I die." The expression here, "that I may give you my blessing," literally, "that my soul may bless you," is not just about emotion. The Hebrew word used here is nephesh, which refers to one's very life or soul. This is a word that refers to life itself. So Isaac is saying that he will bless him with his entire life on the line. However, despite clearly knowing God's will, which I mentioned earlier from Genesis 25:23, the older will serve the younger. Isaac is trying to pass on the blessing according to human affection and the social norm that the firstborn should receive it. He is now acting contrary to God's promise. The fact that his eyesight had grown dim seems to imply that he had lost his spiritual discernment. In Deuteronomy 34, we see the final scene of Moses' life, and there he is evaluated with the phrase, "His eyes were not weak." This is not simply about his physical eyesight not failing, it is a spiritual assessment of Moses maintaining his spiritual discernment until the very end. The fact that Isaac grew old and lost his sight signifies that his spiritual discernment was wavering. The Bible describes a state of spiritual dullness, where one cannot see what one ought to see, and cannot make the right decisions, as having dim eyesight. When one's spiritual vision is distorted and blurred like this, one tries to handle God's blessing with human methods, but such an attempt is truly foolish. We already know from the preceding story of Abraham how difficult a situation arises when one tries to fulfill God's promise with human strength. Abraham's choice of a human method to continue the line of the promised offspring was to take the Egyptian woman Hagar. This eventually led to the birth of Ishmael, and because of this, his family experienced great hardship. In today's passage, Isaac is now walking that same path. If we look at the story just before today's passage, in Genesis 26, Isaac had a spiritual center, not worrying about what he shouldn't and worrying about what he should. But as his final days approach, we can see that his spiritual discernment is wavering. Therefore, it seems Isaac's human attempt is not unrelated to Jacob's deception, his flight, and the subsequent division in their relationship. The attempt to fulfill God's promise through human means ultimately brings about greater problems and pain. Rebekah overhears the conversation between her husband Isaac and her son Esau, and she instructs Jacob in a deception so that he might receive the blessing instead of Esau. The reason Rebekah acted so radically may be because she had kept God's promise well in her heart, while Isaac, with his dim eyesight, tried to pass on the blessing according to his own will and the world's natural order, contrary to God's promise. Perhaps Rebekah wanted God's will to be done, no matter what. However, no matter how good the desire, if one does not choose a good method to achieve it, this image of Rebekah choosing an unrighteous method is not much different from Isaac's, who had lost his discernment due to dim spiritual sight. A good desire pursued through a human method, a desire for God's will but abandoning that will for a human choice. These two do not seem very different. God's promise will be fulfilled one way or another, but both parties will have to pay a corresponding price. In verse 12, Jacob says, "What if my father finds out that I am deceiving him? I would bring a curse on myself." In verse 13, Rebekah responds, "My son, let the curse fall on me." The word that appears repeatedly here is curse. If we look up the meaning of this word in the original language, it does not simply refer to misfortune or difficult situations. The word translated as curse here is a heavy word connected with God's judgment. These verses are, in fact, foreshadowing the hardships this family will face due to this deception. The reformer Martin Luther is said to have stated, "God's promise cannot be fulfilled by man's unjust methods. The author of the promise and the author of its fulfillment is God." It seems Rebekah did not fully realize this fact, and so she is making God's work more complicated. Of course, God works and teaches even through this complicated process they go through. We know the story in the Bible. Isaac's spiritual discernment grew dim. Rebekah's deception was foolish. These complicated and foolish human affairs intervened in the continuation of God's blessing, but in the end, God accomplishes his will. However, in the process, Jacob had to spend about 20 years as a wanderer and, after leaving home, never saw his beloved mother again. They had to endure a lifelong separation. What a painful process. What a painful price they had to pay. In 1 Corinthians 3, the Apostle Paul describes our fragile salvation as being saved, but only as one escaping through the flames. This is an expression for a salvation that is barely obtained. Perhaps if they had just left it to God's natural way, it would have been fine, as God ultimately fulfills his will. But human anxiety, impatience, and the human heart try to hasten God's work, only to bring about greater difficulties. In fact, the reason our lives get twisted and we sometimes fail and suffer is not because God is not working, but because I keep pushing God's work back. God does things better, more fittingly, more rightly, but I keep trying to turn that direction and obstruct it. Dear brothers and sisters, we must remember, God's promise is not fulfilled by man's unrighteous methods, but in God's time and by God's methods. I hope we remember the story of Zechariah and Elizabeth in Luke 1. Zechariah and Elizabeth were without a child for many years, but they waited for God's promise. However, when an angel appeared and prophesied that they would have a child, Zechariah could not believe it, so he fell into the difficulty of being unable to speak. How frustrating that must have been. Faced with an unbelievable promise, he was completely blocked from expressing his frustration to anyone. But what happened in the end? The promise God made was fulfilled. John the Baptist was born. Zechariah had to spend his days in frustration, unable to speak, but God's promise was fulfilled despite human unbelief. It is not our devotion and zeal that fulfill God's promise. It is God who fulfills his promise. The Christian spiritualist Andrew Murray, emphasizing the trust that God's promise is fulfilled in his good way and time, not by our impatience and methods, is said to have left this quote, "Here I am, by God's promise, in God's protection, under God's training, waiting for God's time." I believe this confession must become the confession of us all today. The story in Genesis 27:1-13 teaches us the truth that our lives are led not by human methods, but only by God's promise and faithfulness. Despite our impatience, favoritism, unbelief, and mistakes, God surely fulfills his promises. Therefore we must trust only in the Lord, and we must not miss the truth that human methods will surely have a price and that true peace and blessing come only from God. God's promise does not depend on human methods. Only God fulfills that promise. With this faith I bless you in the name of the Lord to live a blessed life, enjoying God's grace today.